Друзья, всем привет!
Dear friends, hello everyone, surfers, loafers, deviants. We continue our broadcast, and today we have a very unusual guest. I would even say that this is the first time that we have a guest of this level. This is Richard Deitz, who heads the VR Capital Group, and he is also the manager of the VR Global Partners Investment Fund. Actually, I think that most of you do not know that this fund is one of the largest investors in the Ukrainian economy. It has invested about $1 billion, and in fact is the second, correct, after the EBRD on investments in Ukraine in recent years. And given that we have an investment policy on everyone's mind, President Zelensky constantly says that it is necessary to attract investments. Huge plans are constantly announced about the fact that there are billions, tens of billions in investments that will be attracted to Ukraine. Then your experience in Ukraine, it seems to me, will be extremely interesting because, firstly, it is practical, and secondly, you already have specific cases that allow you to say with a certain accuracy what investors are facing in Ukraine, what are the pitfalls, and everything in general. I think you will share this experience with us on air today. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Let's start with why you came to Ukraine. Why did Ukraine attract you in principle? Because everyone knows that from the outside, taking into account all the events that have taken place in recent years, war, corruption, and other factors, in general, they do not create the most attractive image for Ukraine for large investments. Nevertheless, you came, and nevertheless, you invested quite a lot of money in the Ukrainian economy. Why? How was your motive formed? Why did you do this? What were you guided by?
Well, Yurii, my involvement with Ukraine actually is a very long one. Back in 1994, I was one of the first Western-trained investment bankers to be living in the post-Soviet space. And in 1996, I made my first investment in Ukraine. So I have a 25.
How old are you?
Oh, a sensitive question.
56. So I made my first investment in Ukraine in 1996, and so I can say that through the entire post-Soviet period of Ukrainian independence, I've been involved in the country. I've been investing in the country. And I've seen it develop. I've seen that it's an incredibly difficult process. Why do we invest in Ukraine? I think fundamentally why we invest in Ukraine is a belief in the people and a belief in the potential of the country. Ukraine's problem is not its people. Ukraine's problem is its people have been let down repeatedly by its governments. It's a chronic story of corruption, interference, oligarchs, and non-transparency. And so while we're optimistic about Ukraine, and that's why we've invested, we're also, as investors, we're skeptical people. We have to be. And what changed for me really in Ukraine was Maidan. I came to Ukraine in February of 2014. I think it was about 10 days before Yanukovych fled. Mm-hmm. And I came for business meetings, and I went to various different business meetings in Kiev. But what really made the biggest impression on me was the time that I spent on Maidan. I walked around and I saw the people. I saw people who came from all walks of life in Ukraine. And they came for a simple thing, to demand their rights. They were in the cold. They were camped out. They were ready to stay as long as it took to get those rights. And from that moment, I understood that this was an opportunity to invest more in Ukraine, that these were the people that I wanted to back. And that for all the difficulties of that period, and for the annexation of Crimea, and for the war in Donbass, and all of the awful things that happened, that period was really a crucible in which a different country was formed, in the way that we looked at it. And that was something that we thought deserved support. And at a time when the economy was in crisis, when investors were fleeing the country, we took a different approach, and we felt that we should invest more in the country. And we invested very heavily through that period.
Relatively speaking, you have a certain amount of money that you are ready to spend, invest in this or that country. In the Ukrainian case, what part does it make of that volume? Relatively speaking, what money do you manage, and what is Ukraine's share of this amount?
We manage over $5 billion in assets in our investment fund. And of those $5 billion in assets, approximately 20% of them are invested in Ukraine. It's a huge commitment for us.
Is your fund associated with some larger funds, or is it independent? When I wrote you on Facebook that I would talk to you, people asked me to ask a question about who is the owner of the fund. That is, whether you are the owner of the fund or you have some partners. Who's behind it?
So I'm the founder of VR Capital. I founded the company in 1999. We started with a very small fund at that time, and over the years, through our success in investing and attracting clients, it's grown into a rather large fund. Our clients come from the U.S. primarily. They're large blue chip institutional investors. Some of the most well-known names in the United States are invested with us. We have investors from Western Europe, and so it's a single vehicle. It's clear, it's transparent. We report to our investors on a monthly basis. We provide them audited financials, and they understand what we're doing.
Where are you from? From the United States?
Yes, I was born and raised I was born in Washington, D.C., and I lived my entire life in the United States until 1994 when I moved abroad.
In what countries, in addition to Ukraine, do you still work? And why do you work in these countries?
We invest, most of our work is done in emerging market countries. That includes Ukraine, it includes other countries in Eastern Europe. Very prominently, it includes Argentina and in Latin America. We're major investors there. We invest in Asia and Southeast Asia. In China, in India, so we have investments in many places.
In these countries, Argentina or China, India, what sectors of the economy did you invest in, and why?
Across a wide variety of sectors. Most of what we do we're debt investors. So we tend to lend money, provide capital for businesses to grow. We tend to work with more problematic situations where we have a particular expertise in working through debt restructurings, in negotiations, in the kind of things that take borrowers who have problems, either because there's a large macroeconomic crisis or because they have a particular business problem, and where we can work with them to put their business back into a condition that they can operate it and where their debts become sustainable.
When you entered Ukraine, you obviously did some kind of analysis, because not only did you enter Ukraine, you entered Ukraine in a very difficult period. You said this at the beginning, when there was Maidan, when the annexation began, then the events in Donbass, and of course, you yourself said that you analyze, you give reports to your investors, because you cannot act just randomly. Accordingly, before entering, you analyzed Ukraine. Which segments of the economy seemed the most interesting to you, and why?
So the first thing that we leaned on was our experience in the country. It wasn't a new country to us. We had over a decade of experience investing here, and we knew and had experience with many of the main companies here. We had experience with the state banks, with Oshad Bank, with Ukrzaliznytsia Bank. We had experience with Ukrzaliznytsia. We had experience with MHP, with Kernel. So we understood the strong sectors of the economy, and we understood the value of those businesses, and then it was a question for us of being able to believe and convince ourselves that that we would live through this period and emerge with better times, and we strongly believed in that. We really strongly believed that this process of reform in Ukraine was something that was strong and irreversible. And so looking not at 2014 or 2015, but thinking for ourselves, 2 years ahead, 3 years ahead, what can Ukraine look like? We saw the opportunity for a better country. And then we also understood the role that we could play to help catalyze that, because many of these companies were clearly going to need a debt restructuring. And to do a debt restructuring, they had to have partners to work with. And we know how to be those partners. We know how to sit down at the negotiating table. We know how to analyze the balance sheet. We know how to talk about structures that can work for borrowers and also for investors. We know how to communicate to the markets. In the bond markets, we're considered to be a leader in this area. And so we understood that when VR Capital comes and VR Capital makes a negotiation for a debt restructuring with these companies, that's a debt restructuring that we can sell to other investors and bring them along and create a successful outcome.
What level of profitability do you expect when you enter the market? Because, well, in general, if you look at the Western market today, we see that there is risk, panic on one hand, but on the other hand, you can earn amazing profits. For example, by buying Tesla shares. I think that you could have bought these shares in due time and regretted not having bought, because the profitability is crazy there, right? But nevertheless, you invested in Ukraine, and not only in Ukraine, Argentina, India, and so on. What is the threshold level of profitability for you, which allows you to say, that's it, this is enough for us to start playing in the market? What is it?
Look, it depends on the risk. It's impossible for us to say a certain level, 10%, 12%, 20% return is enough. It depends on how much risk we think we're taking. In general, though, I would say that we look for returns that would definitely be in double digits, 15%, 20% type returns over a period. And we look to generate those returns through not just through the investment itself, but through the effort that we put into that investment to fix problems.
Another question. You entered Ukraine and started working in such a very specific area, which is incomprehensible to most Ukrainians. I mean, the purchase of problem loans. That is why you became known in Ukraine, including to me, due to the purchase of Ukrzaliznytsia's Deitz. And the whole story began to unfold around this, which, well, you can tell us further. Could you explain to our viewers how it works? Because, well, many do not understand how debt can be converted into profit and how one can earn from it.
Sure. Let me talk about NPLs, non-performing loans. So banks, the business of banks is to lend money. Banks lend money, they charge an interest rate, they get repaid. The problem is that sometimes loans don't get repaid. And then banks have to do something with those loans. Usually what they do is they send them to a special unit in the bank that deals with non-performing loans. When you have a macroeconomic crisis, such as you had in Ukraine with Maidan, or the global financial crisis, or you had it in Greece and other countries in Europe, the amount of problem loans in the banking system soars. It becomes very high, and the banks become overwhelmed. They become overwhelmed. They're not equipped to deal with those problems. And in some ways, the bank almost goes into cardiac arrest. They have so much problem loans on their books, they can't do their own business. They can't lend money. They can't recycle the capital into the economy. And that has a very negative effect on the economy itself, because if banks can't lend, businesses can't borrow. If businesses can't borrow, businesses can't expand, and you end up with a downward cycle. So to break that cycle, banks typically start to sell their non-performing loans. There's too many for them to work out themselves. They don't have the skills to do it. And that happens everywhere. In Western Europe, for example, in the last 5 years, there's been 60 billion euros of NPL sales. In Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, in Serbia, in Croatia, in Romania, other places. The usual who buys those NPLs, almost always it is investment funds like us. 85% of those sales in Europe that I talked about went to investment funds. And the investment funds are specialized in the work that's required to solve those non-performing loans, to negotiate. They have a balance sheet that can handle that. They don't have depositors to worry about. So that's the way that banks clean themselves and go back to doing their business of lending to the economy. And this issue of working out unresolved loans is generally handled by funds.
In Ukraine, what percentage of your investments was in debts? That is, could you divide your share into what was in debt and what was actually in direct investments?
The majority of our investment in Ukraine is in renewable energy. We have about 60% of the roughly $1 billion we have invested is in the renewable sector. And there we have built from greenfield with our own money, without debt, 30 solar and wind stations. It's a total of about almost 650 megawatts of capacity that we supply to the grid. And that's the beginning. It's a direction where we created an entire standalone company. It's called Elementum Energy. There's a team in Kiev that runs that business. And we have big plans for that business. Now, in Ukraine, we want to expand further. The team in Kiev is now working on expansion in other countries in the Black Sea region. So we're trying to build here in Ukraine, a big renewable energy business. And importantly, we're building and preparing for after the green tariff period. So now our focus is on building with private off-takers and private contracts that don't involve any state subsidies. We think it's critically important. And we're looking forward to projects for green hydrogen. If I can say a couple words about that. Green hydrogen is really a future for Ukraine. It's a very important future direction. Europe is going to decarbonize. To decarbonize, they need a different liquid fuel. That liquid fuel is green hydrogen. And so in the future, Ukraine has tremendous renewable resources in solar and wind and biomass. And in the future, our vision, and we want to be part of this vision, and we're ready to invest. We have plans to invest up to another $1 billion in Ukraine to help develop this vision. Our long-term vision is that Ukraine should be supplying green hydrogen to Europe, and that green hydrogen should replace Russian gas. All of this discussion about Nord Stream 2, what we want to do is put Nord Stream 2 out of business. We want to make it obsolete.
In your estimate, how much green hydrogen could Ukraine produce so that it would be, more precisely, how profitable can it be for you, and how serious is such a prospect in general? Because many in Ukraine do not understand the prospects and look at it so skeptically. Well, it might work in 2050, but now we see an energy crisis in Europe, and we understand that this crisis is directly related to the fact that the transition to green energy sources is stimulated. And this is what you're talking about regarding green hydrogen. This is exactly what will be mainstream in the next 10, 15, 20 years there.
I think 10, 15 years is the right time frame. It's not something for tomorrow, but it's something that you have to start building. If you want it in 10 years, if you want it in 15 years, you have to take it seriously today. You have to have a national strategy for it. You have to create the right investment conditions. You have to have rule of law. You have to have the things that are going to bring the pieces together to do that. What's clear is that Europe very much wants Ukraine to be its partner in this, and they're ready to make commitments. But it needs a lot of commitment from the Ukrainian side, and some of the technology exists today, and some of it is still being developed. But I wouldn't bet against the remaining bits of technology being developed and the costs coming down. The history of renewable energy is that we see continuing decline in costs today. You can produce solar energy or wind energy 4 to 5 times cheaper than you could a decade ago. And I think the same thing. There's no reason to think the same thing won't happen with hydrogen.
Relatively speaking, if you are investing in hydrogen production here, then you need renewable energy in order to produce green hydrogen. In principle, there are enough places in the south of Ukraine where you can place fields. You know this better than me. But you also need the appropriate equipment to start producing green hydrogen. How long does this cycle take, and how much does it cost to make this business profitable to you?
Today we're at the stage where what we need to build is demonstration projects. Not full-scale, utility-scale projects, smaller demonstration projects that demonstrate the technology, that provide proof of concept, and that create the routes and paths for delivery of that hydrogen. In the meantime, the technology continues to improve. And so it's difficult to say today what the cost is going to be, because the big investments are really going to be made 3 to 5 years down the road.
Okay.
But what we need to see, what we need to see is green hydrogen at $1 per kilogram. And today, let's say, the cost is closer to $3 per kilogram. That's the path that needs to be traveled to make it fully commercially viable.
Richard,
now let's touch on another important component of your business, debts. And in fact, the topic that, in general, made you well known in Ukraine in narrow circles, in business circles. I'm talking about the situation that arose with Ukrzaliznytsia, with the debts of Ukrzaliznytsia, which you bought from Prominvest Bank. And the main discourse that developed around the situation, that you in principle could not buy these debts because the Russians were behind Prominvest Bank. They were under sanctions, and accordingly you, as it were, could not make such a deal. Tell us how the situation came about and how it developed.
So, first, I think that there are parties who didn't want this auction to happen. That's clear to us. So what in reality happened was a very clear and clean, transparent auction. And I think there were parties who either didn't want the debt sold or wanted it sold in a way that was less transparent, where more opaque schemes would be used. And once the auction happened in a way they didn't like, which was a clear and an open and transparent way, they began to make noise. And this is part of that noise. In reality, yes, Prominvest Bank is a subsidiary of Vnesheconombank. That's a fact. So before the auction, we hired 3 teams of lawyers. We hired Ukrainian lawyers, we hired European lawyers, and we hired American lawyers. And we gave each of those lawyers the task of evaluating for us whether or not our participation in that auction would be consistent of the sanctions regimes of those respective countries. And we got 3 opinions on each sector that was all clean and all gave us a green light to proceed. So we proceeded in that auction very confident that it was consistent with the sanctions regimes. With respect to the money that was paid, we ensured, and it's a fact, that every single dollar that was paid, and we paid $123 million for this loan, every single dollar that was paid went into Ukraine to Prominvest Bank. And that money was used, if you look at Prominvest Bank's accounts, it's very clear that money was used to repay the Ukrainian depositors of Prominvest Bank, and primarily physical persons. So in reality, our money went to repay the Ukrainian depositors of the bank. And if the bank hadn't been able to make that sale, then in all likelihood it would have ended up in the deposit guarantee fund, and it would have been either been the depositors themselves who lost money, or the deposit guarantee fund who made good those deposits.
Another question that constantly revolves around the situation. You could read it in the media that this auction itself, which you are talking about, was fictitious, and it was associated with the team of the past president, Petro Poroshenko. And therefore, your company is accused, in fact, of participating in such a transaction in order to participate in the redistribution of assets. And in fact, when Zelensky had already come to power, and you started trying to get Ukrzaliznytsia to pay its debts, then given the confrontation between Zelensky and Poroshenko, his team, the team of the incumbent president, used this argument in order to default on the obligations before your investment fund. Can you explain this situation so that the audience can understand it a little bit better?
Sure. So again, this is another story that's been invented. And I think it's been invented by the people who, again, didn't want the auction to happen, wanted it to happen in a different way, and so it's a story that they've made up. What's the reality? The reality is that we have a $5 billion fund. Our investors come from the United States. Our investors come from Western Europe. We are regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States. We're regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority in the United States, in the United Kingdom. These are serious regulators, and it's a serious business that we have. There is no way that we would risk our business for some kind of corrupt deal. We don't do that. That's not the way we've ever done business. We don't manage money for politicians. We don't manage money for the former president of Ukraine. We don't manage money for the present president of Ukraine. We don't manage money for politicians in Russia. We don't manage money for politicians anywhere. We manage money for institutional investors from the United States and Western Europe. So there's no truth, there's no basis to that. In reality, far from being a fake auction, this was probably the most true and competitive auction ever in Ukraine. There's no case in Ukraine besides this of an NPL of this magnitude being sold successfully in a clear and transparent auction, and being sold for a realization. I'll remind you again, $123 million we paid for this non-performing loan. No such transaction has ever happened in Ukraine. And if you compare it to last week, what's the United Metal and Chemical Company or Machinery and Chemical Company was supposed to be privatized, I think, on Friday in Ukraine. That auction was canceled again, and it was canceled because there were no bidders. There were 28 people who registered. They didn't bid because they weren't given access to due diligence materials. They weren't given the time. They didn't have comfort in the investment environment in Ukraine. So what Ukraine needs is more successful auctions like the type that we participated in, and fewer of these auctions that are unsuccessful because they're non-transparent.
As far as I remember, the auction was held in 2019, right? How did the events develop after it? That is, you received these debts. By the way, the debts, as our viewers might not know, debts were formed even before the Maidan. That is, it was in the times of Yanukovych. Russian banks then actively entered the Ukrainian economy and bought up or actively lended to certain segments, including with the prospect and understanding that in the future they could be collected for debts. That was the game, as I understand it. This auction went on, and then there were obviously some rules. After what time did you start claiming these debts? Or why did the conflict arise? How did it start to take shape?
To answer that question, I have to go all the way back to 2015. In 2015, I led the creditor committee that renegotiated the Eurobond debt of Ukrzaliznytsia. So we sat with management, we renegotiated that debt, and at that time, according to Ukraine's IMF program, Ukrzaliznytsia was required to restructure its foreign debt. And its foreign debt consisted of three pieces. It consisted of its Eurobonds, a loan from Sberbank, and a loan from Prominvestbank. And so as a condition of that Eurobond restructuring, which was the first of the restructurings to be done, the company Ukrzaliznytsia committed to restructuring the other two pieces of debt as well. It then restructured with Sberbank, but it didn't, for reasons I don't really know, it wasn't successful in restructuring with Prominvestbank. So when that auction came along and we were invited to participate, even before the auction took place, I came to Kiev and I met with the CEO of Ukrzaliznytsia. I met with the head of the legal department. I met with Ivan Yurii, who subsequently became the CEO, and other members of top management. And we asked them, do you have we told them about the auction. They were aware of it already. And we asked them a simple question. Will it be helpful for you if we if we become the owner of this debt with an intention to restructure with you? Or is this a piece of debt because of politics, because of something else we don't know that you would not want us involved in? They were very clear with us. They said, it's commercial debt. We're happy to restructure it with you. We know you. We've worked with you in the past. And we're willing to renegotiate the debt with you. It's our intention to renegotiate the debt. So on that basis, we participated in the auction. We felt confident to do that. And as soon as the auction finished and we were the winners, we sent a letter to the company with a debt restructuring proposal. And it was a very good restructuring proposal, I should say, from the company's perspective. We offered to write off all of their penalties, all of their overdue interest, and even part of the principal amount of the loan. And we offered to restructure it, not for cash, but for a new bond that was equivalent to the euro bond that they'd already issued.
What payment period?
For 4 years.
4 years.
4 years. Okay. So we made that proposal to the company, fully expecting that we would get constructive engagement with the company. Unfortunately, we didn't get engagement from them. First, they invited us to Kiev to have a discussion. They asked us to put on hold the lawsuits that Prom Investbank had started. We said, okay, we'll put on hold the lawsuits because we're not here to sue you. We're here to restructure with you. Let's have some discussions. But what happened was, over time, we understood that they were just delaying. They weren't seriously interested in having a debt restructuring. Discussions would kind of go on forever. In a way that wasn't leading anywhere. So eventually, we said to them, look, we're going to restart the litigation. We'll still talk to you. We're still ready to restructure, but we have to defend ourselves. If you're not going to restructure with us, we have to move to enforce our rights. So that began the process of litigation with the company.
How did they explain, in fact, what their motive was? I mean, Ukrzaliznytsia's, that they have no money? What is the reason that in this situation they try to default on their obligations?
I think you know that Ukrzaliznytsia has not necessarily been one of the most transparent companies in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
There was a parliamentary commission that investigated a lot of issues at the company. I have difficulty explaining. There's no rational answer for this question. What's very clear to me is that if Ukrzaliznytsia had agreed in 2019 to our debt restructuring proposal, it would have saved almost $110 million versus what its debt is today. Why they didn't do it?
Okay, we understand well that state-owned companies, they are highly dependent on the decisions of the cabinet of ministers and the presidential administration, the office of the president now, as it's called. And accordingly, it is obvious that when you had this problem, then you began to try to reach out there, or to the government, or to the president's office, in order to solve it. But the threads of the decision are there, right? You tried to do this, as I understand it. Or not? What did you do in order to get out of this situation?
So to answer that question, I need to take you on a few steps. So we began to sue them. Ukrzaliznytsia went through several management changes at the time. It was difficult to any management we would talk to. After 3 months, they were changed for another management, so nothing could ever progress. And our legal cases did progress. We didn't sue for anything other than what was in the contract. There's a debt contract, you must pay these amounts. We asked to be paid the amounts that were in the contract. They tried to delay as much as possible those processes, but eventually, in the court of first instance, in the Court of Appeals, and eventually in the Supreme Court, we won judgments against the company. In April of this year, we won our first Supreme Court judgment, and so far to date, we've won 6 Supreme Court judgments against the company. When the Supreme Court judgments were issued, company got on the phone and called us back. Suddenly, after not talking to us for 1.5 years, they were in a hurry to speak to us. Let's solve the problem, let's have a negotiation. Fine, we were ready. We started discussions with them. We simply said, listen, you have to be serious this time. If you're going to approach the discussion, the negotiations of good faith, of course, we're always ready to talk to you. Eventually that led to a request for me to come to Kiev It was in July of this year. I was in the U.S. I was on holiday. I was hiking with my kids in the mountains and camping. I dropped all of that and flew to Kiev for a meeting with the company. The purpose of that meeting was supposed to be, was told to me that it was going to be to negotiate a resolution to the problem. The meeting took place in the office of the presidential administration. So now,
High level.
now we're at a high level. So we had two deputy heads of the presidential administration. We had the Minister of Infrastructure there, and Mr. Yurii was still CEO at the time of the company. He was there. And so we had a meeting. It became clear to me very early in the meeting that there was no interest from their side in a good faith negotiation. There was no proposal. I had already sent them a proposal, which was again a discount to the amounts of the debt. And I said to them at the meeting, let's start with what our legal claim is. We know what's happened in courts. And from there, let's talk about how we can manage the situation. We can talk about discounts. We can talk about stretching out over time. We can talk about all the things that Ukrzaliznytsia would need so that this debt is sustainable. But there was no willingness to engage on that basis. And then, and this is really where things became, really, for me, very disturbing and have really fundamentally made us rethink our ability to continue investing at all in Ukraine. I was told by the legal advisor to the office of president, Andrei Smirnov. He said to me, "Look, Richard, you have very good lawyers. I know your lawyers. They're excellent. They present your case well, and you have a very good case. You have very good legal arguments. But Richard, you should understand one thing. In Ukraine, judges can be dismissed."
That is, in fact, he warned you that the courts are under the direct influence of the president's office.
Exactly. And from that moment onwards, we've seen exactly that happen. We saw multiple judges replaced in cases that we're involved in. I'll give you an extreme example. In the Court of Appeals, if you go to the Court of Appeals, your judges are supposed to be drawn by lottery. There's 54 judges. They're supposed to pick 3 judges randomly. We had a Court of Appeals case. It was told to us that 51 of the 54 judges were either sick or on holiday, and so they picked the remaining 3 justices that were available.
Amazing.
Amazing. An incredible coincidence. And then we had an appellate case in September. So UZ started a case, having lost in the Supreme Court, they had to try to do something. So they started a case, brand new, in which they claimed that the original contract by which we purchased the debt was illegal. And it was illegal because it's very technical, they say it was a factoring agreement. Factoring is what you do if you're a supplier of milk to a grocery chain and you sell that receivable from the grocery chain to get your money today and instead of 60 days. That's kind of what factoring is. But they said that this thing, which has nothing to do with factoring, was a factoring transaction, and that's something that it can only be done by a licensed company in Ukraine. And so they want to invalidate the original sale agreement. That got rejected by a district court, and it went to a court of appeals. Suddenly, we saw a hyperactive response from the government. One of the judges was replaced at the 11th hour, and then we were never even informed formally of the appellate hearing. And instead, well, our lawyers heard about it, so they went to court, and they showed up in court, and they said, listen, we haven't been told about this hearing. We're required to be given 2 weeks' notice by law. Why don't we adjourn for 2 weeks? We'll prepare our papers. We can come back in 2 weeks and argue the case. The judges said, no, you can come back tomorrow morning. We'll give you till tomorrow morning. Come back tomorrow morning ready to argue your case. Our lawyers worked all night. All night. They wrote a 68-page brief in one night. They came to court the next morning. They submitted the brief. They said to the court, can we have an adjournment for 48 hours so you can read our brief, and then we can argue the case. The court said, no, we don't need to read your brief. Let's have oral arguments. So they went right into oral arguments without the judges even having read the materials. There was 1 hour of oral argument, and then the judges left. The judges said, okay.
Welcome to Investnyanya.
Yes, everybody stay here. We'll go to our chambers. They went for 2 minutes to their chambers. They came back, and they gave a verdict against us without ever reading our papers, without any serious hearing, and with all these procedural irregularities. And then the next morning, we received the 16-page written opinion from the justices. Now think about this. To write an opinion, somebody has to write that opinion. There's 3 judges. Each of the judges has to read the opinion. Before they even write the opinion, they should read our papers, which they hadn't read yet. All the judges have to read the opinion. They have to make their comments. They have to reconcile their comments. They have to exchange it a few times to get a final text. All of this happened in 24 hours. Very clear to us. That verdict was written before the hearing.
Next, what now? What is the logic of your actions? What are you going to do? Have you exhausted the opportunity to defend your interest in the Ukrainian courts? And accordingly, if they are exhausted, then probably you'll move to another level, to the level of international courts, London or I don't know. Is this the logic behind your actions? What are you going to do?
It's the following. We appealed to the Supreme Court, so we filed an appeal to the Supreme Court. We've outlined all of the legal deficiencies of the ruling. We've outlined all the procedural deficiencies of that ruling. And we expect before year end for the case to be heard here by the Supreme Court. We certainly hope the Supreme Court will overturn the ruling. There's already existing Supreme Court precedent in Ukraine that supports our position. Mm-hmm. So all we really want is for the Supreme Court to be consistent with their prior rulings. And so we certainly hope that that's going to be an opportunity to rectify the mistakes, infirmities of the appellate court decision. If it continues like this with administrative interference, then we'll seek recourse internationally.
Do I understand correctly that this money that you paid, well, I mean, for the debts to Prominvest Bank, in the event of such a scam from the state, you simply lose them? That is, you paid the money, the state won't return it to you. That is, if relatively speaking, they say that you are not in the game, that there is no deal, then they should logically give your money back. Is there talk about getting your money back, or?
No. So if they were to determine, if the Supreme Court were to determine or agree that the transaction was invalid, mm-hmm. then the transaction would need to be reversed and the parties would need to be put in their original positions. So the debt would go back to Prominvest Bank, the $123 million would have to come back to us. Mm-hmm. So
is it possible?
That's a good question. We're not sure where Prominvest Bank is going to have that money now. So we would become a creditor of Prominvest Bank. And Prominvest Bank's only asset is this loan. So maybe through another legal process, we'll get the loan through being a creditor of Prominvest Bank. Mm-hmm. Difficult to say. But what would happen is that, leaving that issue aside, is that instead of UZ dealing with an American investor who's willing to work with them on a basis of compromise, who's willing to restructure their debt and reschedule it in a sensible way, they'll be dealing with a Russian state bank who will be, I don't know, but I presume they'll be a little bit less willing to be, a little bit less flexible in the way that they're able to deal with that situation. So I don't see how it improves the situation. What's clear for UZ is they owe this money. Whether they owe it to us or they owe it to Prominvest Bank or they owe it to whoever the ultimate owner of that loan is, it's a loan, a bona fide loan that they have to pay.
The office of the president, or someone in the level of the cabinet, well, the office of the president, because we understand that key decisions are now being made in Ukraine in the office of the president. Did they try to resume this dialogue there or not? The last meeting that took place in the summer, was it the last one?
After that meeting that we had in Kiev, we agreed to have a follow-up call about 3 weeks later. We had that call, and the call made no progress with respect to resolving any of the issues. And since then, there's been no dialogue.
Your
case is very similar to the situation with another big scandal that we have had in Ukraine for 10 years. I'm talking about Sky Mall, the Sky Mall case. There, too, the situation was somewhat different, but it was also associated with the scam against investors, and it's been going on for years. This means that the owners of Sky Mall reached international courts. They went to court in London and won there, as far as I remember, and they threatened that Ukraine will suffer. The state of Ukraine will incur costs in the amount of $750 million. Are you considering a similar procedure, similar steps? And what does this mean for Ukraine as a state? What is it? What costs can it cause?
We really hope it never gets to that situation. If we're in that step, then we've had a real, colossal failure of the rule of law in Ukraine. And that means that not only are we in a court in arbitration against Ukraine, but something really damaging has happened to the investment environment here. And so our focus right now is on the Supreme Court, on trying to correct the injustice of what happened in the Court of Appeals and put things right.
Have you tried to include the American embassy in this process? Because I know that American investors, or investors from Europe, from the UK, the Netherlands, when they face similar situations, they ask for the support of the embassy. And as a rule, it was quite effective. More precisely, it was almost always effective, especially if you take the means of the American embassy. Have you tried to appeal to the Americans for support?
I can say that I'm very confident that the U.S. Embassy is following this case very closely. They've been kept informed. They're well informed about the case. And it extends beyond the embassy in Kiev. We've had multiple conversations in Washington with different departments of the U.S. government and with the legislative branch. And so I would say that there are many parties from the U.S. government who are quite aware of the situation.
What consequences will this case have for the entire NPL market? What will this impact be? How do you assess it? You obviously had some kind of communication with your colleagues. What are you expecting?
So that's a great question. And this has really the issues for our case go beyond the kind of rule of law issues that I've described here to issues about financial stability for Ukraine. Because you might ask, how did the Court of Appeals come to find that you couldn't buy this NPL? So they did it by a few means. First, they had to deal with the fact that the Supreme Court has already said that the purchase of an NPL is not a factoring transaction in a different case. So they had to you have to find a distinction. So they said, well, in the case where the Supreme Court ruled that bank was insolvent. In the case of Prominvest Bank, they're a solvent bank. So somehow, for reasons that have no legal logic, they came up with this artificial distinction. So what that means now is that solvent banks, what you want in a system is you want solvent banks to manage their NPLs and to sell their NPLs and to do the things they need to do so that they never become insolvent banks. Now what you've done is you've created, by the logic of this ruling, an incentive or a path for solvent banks to more easily become insolvent because they don't have tools. You've taken tools away from them that they can use to manage their NPLs. So that's one very bad implication, and that's not a theoretical implication. Ukraine is a system with something like 35 to 40% NPLs. The system is full of NPLs, and in particular, the state banks are full of NPLs. Oshad Bank, Korexim Bank. are full of NPLs. Ukrzaliznytsia Bank today is trying to sell an NPL. I think it's for Sky Tower. It's that auction is supposed to take place on Wednesday. 7.2 billion grivna is the amount. Well, if the auctions, as the Court of Appeals would have it in Ukraine of NPLs, are limited to Ukrainian factoring companies, that's a very small pool of capital. There aren't, you're not going to find a buyer who's going to pay a real price for that. So what you're going to end up with is a small club of buyers who don't really have any capital, who will collude amongst themselves to effectively steal assets from banks at very cheap prices. And most of those assets are going to come out of the state banks. And the price for that is going to be paid by the state banks themselves. So this ruling, and it's very ironic because all of the effort that the presidential administration has made against us, purportedly in favor of Ukrzaliznytsia, the logic of it is that it's actually going to end up decapitalizing the state banks.
Right. I don't know if it'd be appropriate in this situation to ask about the investment attractiveness of Ukraine in general, considering your case as well as the SkyMall case and other similar cases. How do you generally see this situation with the investment attractiveness of Ukraine? How will it be developing? Because on the one hand, there is a lot of surplus capital in the world. We know that 2 trillion, trillions of dollars are kind of free. They are looking where to go, right? And Ukraine could be an interesting place to invest it. But on the other hand, this case, it nullifies such initiatives. How do you see the prospect of investing in the Ukrainian economy?
I can answer that on several levels. Clearly, the problem in Ukraine is creating a good investment environment. Rule of law. If you've seen, I think the AmCham, American Chamber of Commerce, published a poll that they did recently of their members. I think by far something like 93% of the members said their biggest issue in Ukraine is rule of law. They all indicated that they want to increase their investments in Ukraine, and they all indicated that the biggest issue for them, holding them back, is rule of law. It's crazy. Why does this government tell the world it wants investment in Ukraine, promise them investment nannies, but then investors who actually invest, like us, more than $1 billion in Ukraine, not only do we not have an investment nanny, but we have the state working against us using administrative resources to try to deprive us of our investment. It doesn't make any sense. So that has to be fixed. And on the other hand, I would say that Ukraine has incredible potential. It has incredible potential in terms of its resources, and most importantly, in terms of its human resources. And I can tell you, I flew here last night. I flew from Tel Aviv, and the woman who sat next to me on the plane, she works for a high-tech company in Israel, and she told me they have 2,000 employees in Ukraine, in Vinnytsia, in Kharkiv, in Dnipro, in Lviv, and I asked her, "Are you expanding?" And she said, our only problem in Ukraine is we can't hire enough programmers. We actually need more. We need more developers. So, but if you think about that business doesn't involve the state at all. That's the beauty of that investment. They invest. They have high-tech workers who work for them, and they don't have to deal with state and the regulation and the sorts of things. So I think that the biggest obstacle to Ukraine's success continues to be the government and the promotion of rule of law.
Еще такое вопросное уточнение.
Another question clarification. One of Zelensky's moves was to shape this discourse about investing money. As far as I remember the idea, investment nannies were supposed to start working with investors when they invested a certain amount of about $100 million. I don't remember how much. Considering your volume, have investment nannies appeared on the horizon or not? That is, these investment nannies, did they somehow indicate that they exist and work with you or not? Or is it a myth?
It's a myth. For me, it's a myth. We don't have an investment nanny. No one has reached out to us to provide an investment nanny, and so no, we have the opposite of an investment nanny. We have the state working to block our investment, unfortunately.
К сожалению, да. Ну что, на этой...
Unfortunately, yes. Well, we probably will end on this minor note.
Я думаю,
I think that for many Ukrainians, and for those who are going to invest in Ukraine, our conversation with you will be very interesting because it gives an understanding of how real mechanisms work, and even more so, that you call things by their proper names. And thank you very much for that.
И за это вам большое спасибо.
Вам спасибо.
Thank you. And I hope that you'll be able to sort out your situation in a positive way for you. Let's hope.
Будем надеяться.
Thanks.